I call Arana Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have 2 points for the Minister, but before I begin, I want to pick up on a comment that the Honourable Rachel Brooking made about the importance of retrospective legislation to have full scrutiny in committee stages when we are under all stages of urgency. We're in a long period of urgency where the government is rushing through legislation. It is really important that we understand the retrospective impact of this law, which is a direct retrospective impact. There are some circumstances in which we would give it a lighter touch because the retrospective impact is not direct. It doesn't impact directly on someone's rights. It doesn't directly impact on a decision which has been made. In this case, there are 500 permits. As the Minister keeps saying, as if that will help us conclude our efforts to investigate this. 500 permits which are directly impacted by this, and 85 directly impacted by the case law moving through the courts. This is something actively being considered by the judiciary. It's something we need to consider at this level very carefully before we impinge on any of the rights accrued before this legislative change was made. And we should not be analysing it, as the Minister has suggested, as if this legislative change has already occurred. The relevant rights and duties for us to consider are the relevant rights and duties that existed before this legislative change. This is something that I will put to the Minister now. How many of the permits that are impacted by this Minister are relying on a situation that was in the law as it was prior to this proposal? How many of those permits will be directly impacted and changed, and what is the scope of the change? Help this House to understand what sort of work was being carried out unlawfully, and whether the work that was being carried out unlawfully was because of an error or because of a decision of the court that was unexpected. We haven't heard from the Minister on who the beneficiaries of this change will be and who those who lose out in this circumstance are. Are their rights being extinguished? Parliament needs to consider, every time we make retrospective legislation like this, who are the losers? Is it their livelihoods that are on the line? Is it their rights? How will they be impacted? What is the effect for the community? We haven't had any discussion of that, Mr. Andy Foster, in this committee stage, and we would welcome a call from New Zealand First about the people who are impacted because of these builds. We've heard from the Minister that it may be roads, that it may be infrastructure that is being built here which is beneficial to the community. That is great. That is something that Parliament should take into account about who benefits and what the cost of retrospectivity is. Because when you extinguish rights for some people to the benefit of others, you should understand the benefits. But you should also understand who is affected. It's not just the kiwis, it's not just the lizards, it's the people who care, the people who have brought these claims that are then impacted by these kinds of decisions.
And in the interim 2 months since this court finding, how many court cases have been brought for breaches of the law now that it's been deemed unlawful? I wonder if the Minister has any answers on that. Because one of the messages that the Environment Law Initiative made pretty clear in their communication with Newsroom was that they did not believe it was likely that there would be any cases brought because the legislation, the Wildlife Act under 68 AB, already has a defence of reasonable efforts.
Last night, in the wee hours, I mentioned that we will accelerate with acuity the review of the Wildlife Act, and as we recall, the previous government was very intent on talking the talk, but we will walk our talk. It's premature to fully articulate the terms of reference for the review that will be undertaken between the Ministry of Regulation and Te Papa DOC, but there will be a post-implementation review and a full-on comprehensive review. Can't wait to get into fifth gear for that matter. In relation to the fuzzy math of the other side, can I note for the 15th time, there are around 500 potentially implicated permits, and right now, and one of the reasons why we're so intent on progressing this, urgent legislation through the House is there are about 300 permits awaiting consideration by the Department of Conservation. Now, whilst some members of the House might not think that's important and we can wait weeks or months or years for another review in committee, we're actually very intent on making sure that important programs, environmental, economic and others, kicked off and started.
About that there needs to be an immediate review, because this has not had submissions. I have been very unsatisfied with the answers that we've been getting from the Minister. And then if the Minister has had any advice, if there are any other actions actually in train at the moment about the Wildlife Act, that would be useful to know as well.
Madam Chair.
The Honourable Tamapotaka.
Appreciate the creative suggestions around an immediate review. We will not be undertaking that. In relation to the Mount Messenger case and the Environmental Law Initiative, the finding actually was that Section 171 authorisation was valid in that instance. We are concerned about the additional, potentially up to 500 permits that are held by permit holders. And one comment that was made this morning and actually last night about the rights of people who may be affected. Yeah, the rights and expectations of people who hold the permits. That's what we are really concerned about. We're really concerned about their provisions and their authorisations.
Is because parliamentarians are charged with the duty of understanding how these things affect their communities. I'll give you an example, Minister. When I worked in Ngāti Whātua Kaipara, in a role that you yourself have held in iwi organisations, I was responsible for the overseeing of a permit granted by DOC that affected the mokomoko, the lizards, in the Wood Hill Forest. And in that situation, the grant of the permit saw a road built in the forest that was agreed with the iwi prior to the building of the road, that the lizards in the area would be removed by the iwi. This made job schemes for the young men who were employed in the work. They were hunters, they were people who did forestry work in the forest, and for a long time they stayed together at the marae and were overseen by kaumātua as they removed these lizards. Not only did they remove the lizards, but they also learned about the history and the stories. There is a lizard on the po of that marae. These are an important part of the history and the things that bring these people together. They are local people who share local stories about this wildlife. In that situation, one day, work was carried out where bulldozers came and removed the trees in an area where this work had not been conducted. And that was devastating for the young men working on this project for a very long time who had dedicated their time and energy to it. The reason I am asking the Minister whose rights are being extinguished by this is because people care very deeply about it. Young men who are working out there in forests right now will have problems with the way that has proceeded over many years. Things go wrong in these situations. Permits are issued wrongly. People take the wrong actions under permits which are granted. They should have the ability for a court, a tribunal, an MP who represents their interests to raise these issues, instead of a minister who comes to this House and says, I'm not going to answer. I'm not going to tell Parliament what I am extinguishing. This is something that should be interrogated by this House. To shut down a debate on this, like the Minister is trying to do, and say, I'm not going to answer on the specific examples, I'm not going to make this real, makes a mockery of this entire process. Why don't we let lawyers decide every time we make retrospective decisions? You know why we don't? Because the real people who are affected by this are represented by us. And this is a Minister who has taken an arrogant approach to changing their rights and taking away their ability to have any say in the processes which not only affect their jobs, their livelihoods, their families, their community. That is a shame, and we should continue to investigate this legislative impact very carefully, because this is the only opportunity we have, not only as Parliament, but as the New Zealanders who are affected by this. Maybe 10 years back, maybe 20 years back, maybe 50 years back. Minister, tell us, how retrospective is this? And who is losing?